Dear students, dear guests, welcome to our joint seminar, Peace and Conflict at Global Level, Contemporary Issues. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany and the Federal University of ABC, Brazil. In this course, we discuss the contemporary tools to conflict management, resolution, and transformation used to promote peace, discussing concrete cases and different perspectives from around the world. We will have guests from different countries and contexts who will contribute with lectures, and students are going to do projects together. In both universities, the course will be offered to students from different disciplines, in Tübingen as part of the Global Awareness Education in the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and as a free extension course at the Federal University of ABC. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues, Federal University of ABC, Al-Hassan Tahiru and me, Glaucia Pérez da Silva, University of Tübingen. Today, we will hear a lecture on Whose Religion, Whose Conflict? Nuances of Religious Conflicts in Sub-Saharan Africa, with Dr. Mustapha from Ghana. I would like to invite my colleague, Gilberto Rodrigues, to introduce our guest.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone. It's a pleasure to join this session again with you. My name is Gilberto Rodrigues. I'm an associate professor at the Federal University of ABC in São Paulo, Brazil. It's our pleasure to introduce Professor Ahmed Mustapha, and I'd like to introduce to you his bio. Professor Mustapha is a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. He holds a Master of Arts in Political Science from the National University of Singapore and has a PhD in International Relations from the Middle East Technical University, Ankara, Turkey. His research focuses on Islam and Muslim societies, particularly in Africa, the interconnectedness of state and religion, militant organizations, political violence, radical ideologies, counter-extremism, and decoloniality. He's currently working on the notion of moderation. It's a word that I cannot pronounce, Professor Mustapha, then you can help me afterwards, and how it is instrumentalized in both Western and non-Western counterterrorism praxes. It's a pleasure, Professor Mustapha, to have you here with us. Thank you very much for sharing this session, and please, you have the floor for your for this session, for your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. I think the Arabic word there might be wasaṭiyyah, maybe, I'm not sure, but that might be the word there. Yes, so thank you for the introduction. I'll quickly try to share my screen with you. I think the title of our session today has already been introduced. And most of you are already aware of it. Whose religion, whose conflict, nuances of religious conflict in Sub-Saharan Africa. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'll try to go through some of these key issues when we're talking about religious conflicts within the setting of Sub-Saharan Africa. So first of all, I would like us to look at some geography, even though I'm not a geographer. Maybe we have some geographers here to help me. And but yet it's really important to look at it. Especially for those of us who are not familiar with the region, and that is my presumption. But if you are already familiar with it, maybe you may take the session as a refreshing of your memory in terms of the geography of the region. So we look at the geography and the religious composition. Then we look at some conceptual issues when we are talking about religious conflict in the region. Then we look at the complex relationship between religion, peace, and conflict in the region. Then we will look at some movements in religious conflicts. Then we conclude, after which I will share some useful tools for tracking conflict trends with you, since my understanding of the entire session is an outreach program to create global awareness. So I thought that it's important, regardless of your field, to follow or to track some trends and see what is happening with respect to conflict globally, whether religious, political, or whatever conflict it is, so that you may be able to contribute towards making the world a better place for all of us to live in. Then we look at Q&A and discussions. So first of all, I would like us to look at a bit of geography of the Sub-Saharan African region. And of course, for those of us who know Africa, Africa is a very broad continent, a very huge continent. So when I talk about the geography, I'm not intending to share the geography of entire Africa, but there are some hotspots. When we are talking about conflict, that's one needs to understand. And I have sort of sieved 3 hotspots that is really important for any student trying to understand conflict, not just religious, in the region to know about. So we have what we call the Sahel. We have what we call the Sub-Saharan Africa, even though there are some contestations about the usage of the term by decolonial scholars, but forget about that. We're just interested in the geography here. Then we have the Horn of Africa. So these 3, geographical spots are really important to understand any conflict at all, not just religious. Then we'll look at the religious composition of the continent. Then we can delve into some conceptual issues. So to go into these geographical, hotspots, I thought it's important to refresh our memory about the entire map of the African continent. And here we have the entire map. And I believe most of us are familiar with the map. But what I would like you to take note, when you look at the entire map of the continent, is to look at the stretch from Mauritania to Somalia. It's a very important belt, it's a straight line. So you can see Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, and so on. So this is a very important belt when we're talking about conflict, and I will explain why. So now coming to the Sahel. So from the onset, you can see why the belt is important. So when we talk about the Sahel region of Africa, this is the orange spot is what we're talking about. You have Mauritania, you have Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Eritrea. It's a long stretch. And in fact, as we can see, it's a semi-arid region, which is very dry with a lot of Sahara, desert. And as a result, there are vast stretches of lands that are not easily controllable by governments in the region. And that, of course, has some consequence in terms of security, in terms of conflict, in terms of, criminal hideouts, in terms of human trafficking, in terms of so many other things that affect global and security in Africa and also global security. So this is the Sahel region. Then we talk about the subcontinent. So again, if you talk about the subcontinent, the starting point also is that same belt we're talking about from the Sahel down forms the sub-region, which is actually very huge. So it means that the sub-region is the entire Africa minus the Maghreb, minus the North Africa, minus say Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, and so on. So again, this is the sub-region. Now, you may want to take note of some of the countries there. So, for example, you can see Burkina Faso, you can see Nigeria, you can see Chad, you can see Ethiopia. Now, when we talk about conflict in Africa, regardless of the categorization of such a conflict, is very likely that you hear one of these names as a reference point in terms of the site of the conflict, right? Maybe, and now the hot thing on our table and the table of the global leaders is what is happening in South Sudan, right? So again, it's the same spot, conflicts come and go in these spots. of Africa. So we have the Horn. Now, the Horn of Africa, as you can see on the top right corner, the green spot actually looks like a horn, right? So the name is derived from the shape of that location, that extreme part of East Africa. Very strategic, very important region, but unfortunately not so peaceful. You can see that it connects, multiple continents and, so many resources there, but unfortunately not so peaceful. So when we talk about the Horn of Africa, usually a reference is made to Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti. Sometimes it extends to South Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, that's that corner, right? So now, if you look at these hotspots, as I mentioned earlier, you realize that they are very important in terms of understanding the geography and the configuration of conflicts in Africa. So we will be making some references to these geographical locations in terms of religious movements, in terms of conflicts, and so on. So what is the religious composition of the Sub-Saharan African region? The African continent is highly religious. And in fact, the dominant religion in the entire continent of Africa is Islam and Christianity. So Islam is dominant in the northern parts, the top, But when we come to Sub-Saharan Africa, the demography in terms of religion changes. So we have Christianity on top, then we have Islam and what they call folk religion, or in the literature, they refer to it as African traditional religions. Now, this data by Pew Research is important in the sense that it's not talking about now, but it's also making some projection. And despite the projections in the future, you can see that the top 3 religions are still maintaining the top position, despite some variations in the figures. So we have 2010. The top 3 religions are Islam, Christianity, Islam, and folk religions. Then the projections in 2050 also have them as the top religions, which means that these 3 religions are going to dominate the region for a very long time, for some decades to come, for foreseeable future. An important thing to note is that when we talk about Christianity or Islam, especially in the sub-region, it's not very monolithic, actually. It's a makeup of so many things, right? There are so many sub-denominations, there are so many new religious movements in there. When you talk about Islam also, in addition to what we know in terms of the Sunni and Shia, there are so many, groupings in between. So which makes it very, very complex, configuration of religious denomination. Now, when you come to the folk religions, or what we call the ATRs, the African traditional religions, that in fact actually get worse in terms of mixture and configuration. Why? Because if you talk about Christianity and Islam, they have scriptures, right? So somehow they have, and we can talk also of messengers or prophets, right? So they have a figure or a scripture that unites them in a way. Despite this, there is a lot of splinter groups here and there. So for the folks religions or the ATR religions in Africa, the division is so enormous because there's no scripture, there's no issue of prophets. So, I mean, people, every tiny village has a way it goes about its folk religion, so this really makes a religion in the sub-region complex. Now, I would like us to move on to some conceptual issues. Now, just like any subfield in the humanities or social sciences, when we talk about an issue or a subfield, there are so many concepts that needs to be untangled, right? And there are so many questions and critical questions that are raised with respect to the questions associated with a particular concept. And this is no different when we are talking about religious conflicts. So a very important point. So there are many conceptual issues, but I have just shortlisted these few to keep us thinking about religious conflicts. So when we talk about religious conflicts in the first place, what do we mean, right, by religious conflicts? This is very important. Now, the word conflict somehow tells us that there is a contestation about something. And that thing, for our purposes, is religious. So there is contestation about something religious. But what aspect of religion is being contested is the main issue here. And that leads to what we call the broadening and deepening of the definition of religious conflict. There are so many definitions in the literature, but I wouldn't dare trying to, bring them up or try to impose any definition on you, but I just would like you to think about it. So religious conflict could be a conflict existing between a particular religion with another religion, right? It could be a conflict within a particular religion, or a conflict with that which is religious and that which is secular, right? So when we talk about that thing religious, the definition is really broad and very expansive. Now, looking at the previous slides in terms of the mixture of religions we have in Africa, now an extended question will be, when we talk about religious conflicts, whose religion are we talking about? Are we talking about Christianity? Are we talking about Islam? Are we talking about ATR? And if we are talking about these, which denomination are we referring to? So these are really, important nuance when we are discussing religious conflict. Now, moving on, something that may help us somehow untangle what we just said is the categorization by one scholar called Paul Powers. Paul Powers wrote about religion and conflict, and he categorized what he called maximalist and minimalist, and also others, in terms of the connection between religion and conflict, right? So by maximalist, he's referring to those scholars who try to connect the worldview of religious violence to religion. That is to say that the very notion of religion actually instigates violence and conflict, right? There are scholars like that. And there are scholars who are very cautious, the minimalists. They think that conflict or violence has nothing to do with religion. That's the other extreme. They think that conflicts are mostly socio-political, economic, or as a result of historical trauma a particular people have gone through, that sort of bring back itself to make them clash with each other, right? So they basically what the minimalists try to do is to take out religion when talking about conflict or violence. And we have those I call the others. The others, for them, somehow they take a middle course, in the sense that for them, religion does not start a conflict or violence, but then it sort of it shapes violence along the line. It shapes conflicts. Religion contributes to conflict somehow. And this very interesting point, which we shall come back to, in a jiffy. So that is another, conceptual issue. Another conceptual issue we may want to think about is the categorization of religious conflicts. How do we categorize religious conflicts to make them intelligible for us to understand what is really going on? So some scholars have categorized religious conflicts into interreligious theological. So what they mean by interreligious conflict is that two different religions sort of conflicting with each other. So talk about Islam, Christianity, clashing. Talk about maybe ATR and Christianity clashing. So that is interreligious conflict. Now, for theological conflict, it's a bit complicated in the sense that theological conflicts is not necessarily between two religions, but as I mentioned earlier, it can also be between that which is secular. So about a particular religion's belief with respect to the role of the state in society or the role of the government, or how should society be governed or organized? Should it be organized based on religious values or secular values, and so on. So this becomes theological conflicts. And we do have, Islamic militants, most of them trying to reconfigure the, international organization of states, for example. We know of the Islamic State, we know of the ISWAP and so on. We'll talk about them later. And we also know in some parts of Africa, we have what the literature refers to as Christian jihadists, especially in southern Nigeria. Very interesting, so this is it. But an interesting thing I would like you to note in between this interreligious and theological conflict categorization is a very important phenomenon of what we refer to as intra-religious conflict or sectarianism. Now, sectarianism or intra-religious conflict is also very prevalent in the region, especially if you talk about Islam. We have the Sunni and the Shia, especially in Nigeria. There has been clashes and a lot of people, injured and some dead, because they are both Muslims, but some are Shia, some are Sunni, right? They clash. And in terms of Christianity, there are also clashes between denominations, actually. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are different Christian denominations. So there could be some clashes between, say, those who believe in the Methodist or those who are Presbyterian, for example, and so on. So there are these interdenominational, and this is really important in terms of categorization. And I personally think that should be teased out because it sort of stands on its own as a category. Then we have a very popular thesis also in the religious conflicts field, which is the mobilization thesis. Now, the mobilization thesis is a tried and tested thesis, especially in the continent of Africa, particularly the sub-region, in the sense that the main strength of the thesis is its emphasis on the mobilizing people to commit violence or conflicts or to conflict with each other is very high. So what do they mean by this? Now, let me give a very practical example. In Ghana, the northern part of Ghana is predominantly Muslim. The southern is predominantly non-Muslim. So they could be Christians or, traditional believers. So if you originate from the northern part of Ghana, I mean, in terms of ethnicity, what it means is that the likelihood that you will be a Muslim is very high, even though not always true, but the likelihood that you will be a Muslim is high. If you are from southern Ghana, the likelihood that you are not a Muslim is high. So talking about mobilization thesis, what this means is that if there is a conflict between a particular religious denomination in the north as against a particular denomination in the south, what that means is that there is going to be an overlap of religious identity coupled with ethnic identity, and that becomes very deadly because the forces of mobilization becomes really strong. And we have seen this in Africa a lot. The demography in Ghana is like that. If you go to Nigeria, for example, for those of you who know Nigeria, northern Nigeria is predominantly the Hausas and the Fulani, and they are predominantly Muslims, right? If you go to southern Nigeria, we have the Igbos and the Yorubas, and especially the Igbos, are mostly Christian, right? So, you know, in case of any conflict between, say, Muslims and Christians, there's the likelihood of an overlap of ethnic identity in addition to religious identity. And that's really, so it's really a tried and tested, you know, thesis that is used to explain most conflicts in the region. Of course, we know the popular clash of civilization thesis, and I decided to bring it here because we are talking about conflicts, right? But the interesting thing is that I know the civilization thesis has its own, you know, shortfalls, but particularly in the sub-region, it hardly fits in the sense that most of the conflicts in the region is within states, not interstate, right? Most of the conflict in the regions, that's the first thing, is within states. And also talking about the clash of religions, the religious conflicts also happen within states and mostly sectarian or interdenominational. So this really makes the clash of, you know, civilization a kind of misfit in the context of the Sub-Saharan Africa. So the last but not the least of what I would like to share in terms of conceptual, we'll move very soon, but these are very important things that will help us understand, is militance. So militance is a notion that is discussed by Scott Appleby in his book, The Ambivalence of the Sacred, right? Now, what does he mean by militance? Militance here has been conceptualized by Scott Appleby to mean, he was trying to understand that edge, that willingness by someone to sacrifice his or her life, family, you know, resources, everything for that which is sacred or transcendental, right? So if someone goes into a religious conflict, the tendency that the person is going to lose his life or family or close ones is high, is there, but yet the person goes into it. So what is that motivation? And this is something that scholars of religious conflict are grappling to understand, especially those of us who are working on radical ideologies as well. So it's something very, you know, complex, and it's important, you know, that such a concept exists within the literature. So to tie everything up, now, when we talk about religious conflict, an important question to ask is that, is there really such a thing as purely religious conflict? You know, this is very important, you know, question to ask ourselves. So does a conflict, can we have a purely 100% thing out there that is called religious conflict? And the answer is no. What we could have is that a conflict could play a very significant role in a particular, setting. So we could classify it as a religious conflict, but it plays out in addition to other factors, and we shall talk about that, you know, later. So, so quickly, I would like us to look at the complex relationship between religion, peace, and conflict. Now, we have talked about the dominant religions in the sub-region, talk about Christianity, talk about Islam, talk about African traditional religions. Now, the interesting thing is that all these religions cannot distance themselves from conflict. They could have connection with conflict historically. They could have connection with conflicts, you know, theologically. They could have connection with conflict in terms of followership or practice. Now, the normal argument, usually, especially in terms of Christianity and Islam, is that Islam and Christianity preach peace, right? Which is true to a large extent, but I think there is an important thing to distinguish here when we're talking about conflict in religions. There's a need to distinguish between that which is theological and that which is practical, right? So theologically speaking, a religion could go a long way to distance itself from conflict and violence. That's fine. But in practical terms, we have people who are committing all sorts of atrocities in the name of that religion. And here, the religion becomes, it becomes very difficult for the religion to distance itself from conflict and violence. Why? Because the person who is using religion to commit violence, for example, sees the others who are non-violent as less religious. They are not as religious as him or her, right? So this is really something that it becomes a very complex relationship when we look at the practicality in terms of utilization of religion in conflicts and what the theology of the religion says. It becomes very, complex thing to untangle. Again, coming back to the work of Scott Appleby with respect to the militants, he also talked about the role of religion in conflicts as ambivalence of the sacred. That is to say that, interestingly, on one hand, you find religion escalating conflict. On the other hand, you find religion de-escalating conflict. That is to say that sometimes religion plays a kind of double role as an initiator of conflict and also as a tool for conflict resolution, or the resolution of the crisis. And this is really also a complex, relationship when we talk about religion, peace, and conflict. And I think the next slide will deal into some practicalities of religion intervening with respect to de-escalation, because with respect to escalation, we already know, how religion causes different types of conflicts, both in the sub-region of Africa and elsewhere. But in terms of de-escalation, mostly there are less mention on this, and I thought that we should look at that. Another thing that makes the relationship between religion, peace, and conflicts very complex is what we call the cults or new religious movement. I think I mentioned them a bit. Now, I don't know elsewhere, but in Africa, we have religious cults, or what some scholars prefer to call as new religious movements. Now, the interesting thing about cultism or cults in Africa is that the cults are usually in conflict with the mainstream religious movement or the general society. So they seclude themselves from the society. Now, when they seclude themselves from society, usually the end result is injury or death, in the sense that they follow their leaders so religiously such that if they tell them to die, they die, right? So we have the incident in Uganda, in Kanungu, in March 2000, that killed about 1,000 people because the leader had asked them to burn themselves, right? And they agreed to do this. So the interesting thing about this is that because we're talking about religious conflict and peace, because religious conflicts, usually the end result is injury or death, right? But here we are, cults killing themselves, which is also the end result of conflict in a very interesting, phenomenon. And just last month, for those of you who followed the news, mass grave was, discovered in Kenya. Again, the investigation indicated cultism. The leader, the religious leader, had asked them to starve themselves because the end of time is here. So they should starve themselves to die in order to gain salvation. And they did. And actually about 50 plus people died. So this cultism, because is an aspect of religion, and also because the end result leads to death, and in most cases, or injury, is a subject of interest for religious conflict scholars, you know, in a way. And another point that this strikes the mind on is that, you know, we talk about armed religious conflict, but if you look at the phenomenon of cultism or new religious movement, somehow there is no arm involved, right? There is no, it's not armed in nature. They don't take guns or machetes or something to hit, but unfortunately, due to maybe a wrong notion about eschatological belief and following their religious leaders, they agree to kill themselves. And the last thing with respect to the complex nexus is, as I mentioned also before, is the interplay of religious factors with others. Now, this is just to re-emphasize the fact that whenever there is a religious conflict, you should not, or we should not just focus on the religious ingredients of the conflicts, right? Of course, the religious aspect might be very, very obvious, right? But underneath the religious factors, there could be so many other factors, maybe sociological, maybe political, maybe economical, and so on. So I would like us to move on to look into, I hope I'm within time, to look into religion in conflict intervention. So the next thing I would like us to look at is religion in conflict interventions or resolutions. Now, this is an aspect of de-escalation bit of religion that I mentioned. And I have tried to make it as intelligible as possible, because I know some of the students here might not be necessarily students of international studies or conflict and all that. So we have leadership playing a role, sometimes what I call national or official, then we have local or institutional. Now, religious leaders, I know everywhere they are revered, but they are very much revered in the subcontinent, so much revered. And you can see that in the previous slide, right? To the extent that a religious leader asks you to burn yourself and you burn yourself, means that you really revere the person, right? So because of this reverence, they carry with them a very important influence on their followers. So talk about imams, talk about pastors and priests. They do influence their followers a lot through sermons. And through this, they try to intervene in various things that has already led to conflict, or that has the potential of, you know, bringing out or leading to religious conflict. And I would like to cite just two examples with respect to Ghana. In Ghana, we have the national chief imam. So the national chief imam is like a national cleric who is topmost in terms of, you know, Islamic issues. Now, normally, I don't know elsewhere, but you may share with me also your countries. In Ghana, the charismatic churches, I mean, the pastors, they do what we there's a name they give to it, but they try to predict what is coming. So for example, we are in 2023, right? So November, December of 2023, they'll try to make prophecies. Yes, prophecies. They'll try to make prophecies of what is going to come in 2024. But the interesting thing about the prophecies of the Ghanaian prophets is that they usually prophesize on misfortunes rather than fortunes. So they never prophesize, for example, Ahmed is going to get rich or Ahmed is going to live for 150 years. No, that is not part of their prophecy. Normally it's negative. And unfortunately, one of them actually prophesied that the national chief imam is going to die. I think it was 2 years ago or so, in the coming year. And actually, some youth who also are followers of the chief imam and also his lovers did not take it lightly. So they went to the church of this pastor and vandalized the church. You know, the good thing was that, the lucky thing was that when they went to vandalize the church, there were no congregations there and the pastor was not there. So this was really good. So it was just, you know, physical infliction of some, you know, breaking glasses and all of the church. And now the chief imam intervened and distanced himself from the youth and told them that if they don't back off, I mean, he is not for such acts, you know, and immediately they withdrawn, you know, so that's how influential some of these religious leaders are. So what I would like you to picture here is that, what if he was silent and the pastor's followers also retaliated? You know, this could have escalated into, of course, what we are discussing now, a kind of religious conflict. Now, another example is with respect to the National Cathedral of Ghana. There is an ongoing debate in Ghana about the National Cathedral. And quickly, a bit of context here. So the current ruling party, actually, the flag bearer then, the current president, promised that, he's a Christian, by the way. So as part of his campaign promise, he promised to build a cathedral, a national cathedral in honor of God when he wins the election. And God being so good, he won, you know. So it's now time to fulfill the promise to God to build the national cathedral. But the interesting twist is this. Ghanaians realized that the discourse changed from a personal promise to national promise, right? So which means that the taxpayers' money is going to be used for the cathedral. And this really drew a huge discourse, and is currently ongoing in Ghana. Even Christians, some Christians who, of course, will be happy to see a cathedral, did not see it as morally right to make such a switch. So the discourse was going, and in some quarters, there was this instigations that Muslims in Ghana are also fueling that the cathedral should not be built. Now, upon hearing this, the national chief imam actually took out money, I think about 20,000, I don't remember, of 50,000 Ghana cedis, and donated as part of his contribution for the National Cathedral. And now this looks like an easy gesture, but not quite, because that sort of quenched down the fire and that's rumor and that speculation about the Muslim quarter, because here is he, the top cleric, sort of donating money to support the establishment of the cathedral. So it's an important role he played there. And in fact, as someone who follow, religious discourses a lot, even there are some quarters of the Salafis who are actually sort of challenging him as to the theological rightness or wrongness of that. But that's not our point. But the point that there is some leadership that has been shown there, and that has actually impacted in terms of, taming down something that could have generated a religious conflict. And of course, we know about, at least I have followed because of my research, how some Nigerian clerics actually have been on the leader of Boko Haram to back down on his stance that Western education is really, against the Sharia, right? They warn him that your understanding of the religion is wrong. You need to back down. You need to relook. But unfortunately, as we all know, it did not work until he and some of his bunch of his followers were killed in a raid by the Nigerian security forces. So this is leadership, just a bit of leadership in the context of Ghana and Nigeria. And I believe in other parts of Africa also, the sub-region, things like this do happen. And some of you may know of Desmond Tutu of South Africa. And if you look at some of the influential role he has played in South Africa, you'll understand how religious leaders sort of intervene in conflicts and conflict resolution. Now, the second thing we quickly will look at is what I categorize as national or official. In Africa, there are, in some countries, especially in Ghana too, there are institutions that are recognized by the state to look at issues of peace and harmony, peaceful coexistence. And an example is Ghana's National Peace Council. So Ghana has a peace council that is, the constitution of the council is really accomplished individuals who come on board, who have, who are authority in their field and highly respected, and they could talk to, for example, the president, and the president will listen, those kind of individuals. But the interesting thing here is that when you look at the composition of the National Peace Council, they are made of religious leaders and individuals. So you will see top Christian clerics or pastors, you see imams or Islamic scholars, you see traditional leaders actually constituting this peace council. So which means that going back with respect to the configuration of religion in the sub-region, also in Ghana, by the way, the top religion in the sub-region is also the top religion in Ghana and most parts of the continent. So you realize that the Ghana National Peace Council is made up of top clerics in Christianity, in Islam, and traditional religion. We also have the National House of Chiefs, which is also the same configuration. As you know, chiefs play important, influential role in the African setting, and realizing this, they are part of the national constitution of Ghana in terms of, decision making and all that. So we have the National House of Chiefs, constitution of, various chiefs in different regions. And when you look at the composition here again, you see, Christian chiefs, Muslims, and all that. But the interesting thing about the chiefs is that you find some of them, for example, if a Christian chief is a chief of a particular locality, the person really has to combine in a very delicate way his Christian faith and some aspects of traditional African belief. If the person is a Muslim, he has to engage in such delicate balance. And that makes me actually look at the National House of Chiefs as somehow religious in a sense in terms of conflict intervention. So they do intervene also when there is conflict. Now, the last but not the least in terms of religion in conflict intervention is that we do have a religious base. So that is local or institutional. We have Christian and Muslim organizations doing their own thing. Sometimes we have interreligious networks. So, for example, we have a very popular organization in Ghana, COMOG, the Coalition of Muslim Organizations Ghana. What it does is that, you remember I mentioned about how, Muslims have different sects, right? So they try to bring together the various sects under one umbrella. So whenever there is an issue, they have a united front, especially with respect to, issues relating to conflict or something that will negatively impact, peace and harmony in the country. We also have the Ghana Christian Council or Christian Council of Ghana. They also play similar, role. And I have been to, for example, a number of Islamic programs where the Christian Council is invited, or Christian Council programs where the Muslims are invited. So that's really interesting. So we also have the interreligious network. So religious groups themselves coming together to work on peace and harmony. We have the Interreligious Council in Sierra Leone, for example. We have Faith Alliance in Ghana, which consists of different faiths, especially Christianity or Christians, Muslims, and traditional believers. So a very quick one. Of course, don't be scared. We're not going through all these organizations. I just would like to make a point with this, and I know some of you may already have heard about them or know about them. So I'm not going to take them one after the other, but I just would like to demonstrate something here. So we have movements that are involved in religious conflicts. Actually, I was struggling because there are so many cases of conflicts, right? And we are talking about religious conflict. I was trying to look for a case, but I thought that, no, let me go this way. Let me look for religious movements that are engaged in religious violence, and maybe through that we can make a way out of. So we have on the continent Christianity influence movement, we have Islam influence movement, and we have indigenous African influence conflicts. I use conflict there intentionally because mostly the ATR or indigenous religions do not show themselves in a very unified group as Christians and Muslims. So, for example, an example is the LRA. We know the Lord Resistance Army is a Christian organization which has been in existence for some time now, and even though it has been changing its names and targets and objectives and so on, but is somehow still active. Then we have the anti-Balaka movement in Central African Republic. Some few years ago, they were in the news when the conflict in Central African Republic really intensified, right? And we have also the Christian Jihad in southern Nigeria. So all these are Christian influence movements that are engaged in largely religious, conflicts. Then in terms of Islam influence movement, we have, for example, the Al-Shabaab, which are active in Somalia, in Kenya. We have the Boko Haram I made reference to in Nigeria, and recently a breakaway, group from the Boko Haram, the Islamic State West African Province, also in Nigeria. Then we have the Seleka of the Central African Republic as well. Then we also have the ATR or Indigenous African Religious Groups. Now, with respect to the ATR, as I mentioned, usually you hardly see a particular group, say maybe like Al-Shabaab or LRA, coming out to say that we are indigenous African religion and we are for this. No, what normally happens is that there are very conservative African societies in Africa. So when they realize that there is an encroachment in terms of their religious makeup, there is a resistance, right? The society actually resists. And this was the case in northern Cote d'Ivoire some few years ago with respect to the Poro traditional society, who had encountered, a very difficult encounter with Christians, especially as some of their members had converted to Christianity. So they were trying to sort of defend the conservative nature of their traditional society, and that led to conflicts in a very interesting way. And in fact, in some cases also, Islam also faced such resistance for those who engage in going to villages to preach the gospel with respect to Islam. They also do face some kind of resistance like this. But the interesting thing about the ATR in terms of conflict actually is actually what has come to be referred to as the series of ritual murder, right? Now, traditional African religion have some rituals that unfortunately sometimes demand, human parts actually to be done, or that actually require the execution of human. For example, I don't know, maybe some of you might have followed the case of the albinos in Tanzania, for example. Albinos were being killed for rituals in Tanzania, right? And in the case of Ghana, unfortunately, about a decade ago, there were instances where women were killed rampantly. And what we gathered was that they were used for political rituals, right? So these things, even though, as I indicated with respect to the issue of the cult, it's not directly an armed conflict, but then also has the result of conflict in terms of killing people, right? So that is a very interesting nuance. Now, if you look at these organizations, some of them, as you can see, are influenced by Christianity, some by Islam, some conflicts are influenced by ATR. But an important thing to note is that if you look at them, there is always a transformation in their evolution. Transformation in the sense that, for instance, let's not forget about the categorization of the religious conflict in terms of interreligious or theological. So talk about Boko Haram, for example. Boko Haram started as mainly theological, its fight was mainly theological, right? Western education is not good. Girls should not attend, Western should not go to school and so on. But then it also sometimes engages in interreligious fight by way of attacking Christians, right? So that is the complexity in terms of a particular movement starting a conflict that is theological in nature, but along the line, it engages in interreligious conflict. And also sometimes its target also changes, for example, from the federal state or the government to a local entity and so on. So these are some of the, complications in terms of so if you look at the groups, they are also not very static. That's the point I want to make. They transform in terms of the configuration of the nature of the conflict they engage in, and also in terms of their objective or target, it changes. So this adds to the nuances I actually wanted to highlight. Now, conclusion. So all that we have said, of course, there are so many conclusions we could draw, but to put everything in a nut, religious conflicts do not subject themselves to easy analysis, both in theory and practice, actually. There are so many shades and nuances that one really has to pay attention to. So what that means is that every religious conflict is unique. Every case is unique. Of course, that does not negate the fact that there could be some generalizations. Yes, you could have some generalization in terms of, collection of so many, multiple data and so on. But the fact remains that religious conflict, especially within the context of the Sub-Saharan Africa, is really, really complex in terms of theory and practice. So why is it so? Because of the complexity and the mixture of religions, the complexity in terms of languages, the complexity in terms of ethnicities, right? So, for example, just to give you a fair idea about, the complex nature of the whole thing. So, for example, in Ghana, we have over 100 local languages, right? And Ghana is a very small country. For those of you who know, Ghana is a tiny country. So if Ghana alone has over 100 languages, that tells you a lot, right? So, of course, in terms, this affects, of course, ethnicity also is there, religion is there. So it's really a very complex, thing. So in terms of useful resources, these are some of the resources you could use to keep track or sort of maintain your awareness in terms of what is happening with respect to conflicts across the world, and particularly in the sub-region. So we have the UCDP data, we have the ACLED, and we have also the African Center for Strategic Studies, which also, that is focused on the region, but ACLED and the UCDP is very, broad in nature. But the last one focuses more on African continent in terms of diverse conflicts. So you may want to check them out. I think this brings us to the end of the nuances with respect to the Sub-Saharan African religious conflicts. And hopefully certain things that were clear could be clarified in the Q&A. And also, most importantly, actually, I prefer to learn more from you in terms of your regions and your experiences by way of discussion rather than questions. Yeah, but of course, if there are questions, we could look into them. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. And as I made reference to, I referred to Boko Haram earlier. And for those of you who know Boko Haram, what they really stood for was that Western education was against the Sharia, against the Islamic law. And one of the reasons actually, strangely, it's strange. I will explain why it's strange. One of the reasons they mention that makes Western education against the Sharia is the sort of science education that is within the Western curriculum, right? That is to say that science education does not, in their words, recognize the existence of God, gives more superiority to the human faculty and so on. So the interesting thing is that, yes, religious conflicts, especially in the case of the Boko Haram theological conflicts, has some relationship with science education, because if you look at their whole idea of Western education being against the Sharia, the key issue has to do with science curriculum in Western education, especially. Not just that, but it's one of the points they highlight. So I hope this answers the question briefly. There is an interesting thing when we talk about secularity or the secular state. I mean, the separation of the church and the state, as they say it, in the context of Africa. Because as I noted, Africa is highly religious, right? So we have, in most cases, Africa practicing what is referred to as the concept or the notion of the secular state. But that does not come without contradictions, especially in the context of Africa. There are lots of contradictions in the practice of a secularity of the state, because if we understand secularity of the state to be the neutrality of state in terms of religious practice, or in terms of publicly proclaiming religion, then religion actually plays an important role in the politics and the state formation and the governance of most African states. So for example, just to give you an example about the complexity, when the COVID-19 hit, in Ghana, I don't know of other scenarios, but in Ghana, as a secular state, one of the first things the state did actually was that, well, by the way, the president is a Christian and the vice president is a Muslim, in Ghana. So what they did was that they had what they call the national breakfast for prayer or something like that. And the president invited, top Christian pastors to the presidential palace to have breakfast and to pray, right? And the vice president invited the national, chief imam with some, Islamic clerics to pray. Both meetings happened in the presidential complex. And that was really interesting as someone who is interested in the intersection of religion and states. And it's actually, comes down to this question. So what I will say is that in the case of Africa, rather than the secularity of the state and separating it from religion, leading to sectarianism, it's rather sort of open up the shortfalls with the whole or the entire concept of the separation of the state, the church and the state within the context of Africa. And this also maybe will lead us to a kind of Eurocentrism where it's a kind of cut and paste. The separation of the church and the state, as is happening in Europe, must be replicated in Africa, even if the context is different. And in fact, the context of Africa is different. So rather than leading to sectarianism, in most countries, it's really, you know, it does not necessarily lead to sectarianism, but rather goes on to show, because most states defy it, actually. You can see in the case of the National Cathedral, for example, I cited, if your memory serves you right, you know, a personal promise has become a national project. A cathedral, right? A state that is supposed to be secular is engaged in soliciting money or using taxpayers' money to construct a cathedral. So in a way, what is the line then in terms of secularity or separation between the church and the state? So, you know, so rather than sectarianism, what I will say is that it really brings up some question marks with respect to cutting and pasting the Eurocentric version of the separation of the church and state in the Sub-Saharan African context. Well, this is a very interesting a question, because we all know, I mean, definition of peace is the same everywhere, I believe. Definition of peace is the same everywhere. I mean, to not to have conflict or violence, right? So in the context of Africa, I think maybe a definition of peace could be to understand each other and to allow each person to practice his or her own, you know, beliefs. And in fact, the interesting thing about religious violence in the context of Africa is that if you look at Africa, as I indicated at the beginning of my presentation, it's a very complex society, right? With a mixture of ethnicities and religions and all that. Yet, people live peacefully. But unfortunately, when it comes to religious militants, you tend to wonder where that idea of not agreeing to allow that different other to exist comes from. I'm not sure if you get my point. So you exist in a society with different ethnicities, and these ethnicities actually have maybe different rituals, they have different festivals, they have different way of life, and you exist with them, all right? But on the basis of religion, you decide not to agree, and not just to agree, but not to allow that different other in terms of religious belief or thought to exist. And this is really baffling, and this is something we are all struggling to understand. So peace for me is to appreciate the differences in each other, and to also to be able to live without any violence and conflict as a result. But then there is a very complex dimension, as I mentioned, when it comes to religion, because we coexist peacefully despite the differences in language, differences in cultural practices, differences in so many things. But on religion, it becomes something else, right? And that is something we all are working to find out. You remember the issue of the militants by Scott Appleby I mentioned. I think it's something that we all have to dig deeper into. Yeah, thank you. I think that the first two ones somehow overlap in the sense that it's basically trying to question the efficacy of Western intervention in fighting religious conflicts in Africa. And I must say that it's a two-way affair in a way. I believe that in terms of logistics, African countries do need the support of Western countries logistically. But unfortunately, what tends to happen is that, for example, US has bases in Africa, we know, and other, Western powers. So what usually tend to happen is the fact that they tend to ignore local knowledge in terms of intelligence. And that really costs them a lot. And they tend to fumble, even though with all the logistics they have, they are not able to comprehend the dynamics and the nuances and the complexity of their local, because they do not try to comprehend or to partner with indigenous people to understand the dynamics, So what I will say is that I think that there is a need for reconfiguration of the partnership. That's what I will say. I wouldn't say that African countries do not need the Western countries to fight religious conflict. No, but what I would say that the configuration of the partnership as it is now is a bit problematic, because somehow some of the Western countries actually pretend to be helping with religious conflict, but then also trying to protect their interests. So a very practical example is France in Mali and also part of Niger. Now, Niger has, I can't remember the name of the village. There is a huge deposit of uranium, maybe you know, maybe you don't know, in Niger. And most of the protection and participation or the focus of France with respect to trying to help in conflict resolution centers there. So the question is France, for example, try to protect its interest of, extracting uranium in that border town between Mali and Niger, or is rather interested in, resolving a conflict because it wants to see conflict-free Africa? So these are some of the difficulties. So I think that the partnership needs to be, reconfigured. That would be the short answer I could give. The issue of militants and elections, yes, as I mentioned, the target and the objectives of militants actually, or religious movement that are engaged in religious conflicts changes, right? So even though it is a religious movement, but the target could be to see a government that is theocratic in nature, a government that rules by the scripture, say the Bible or the Quran, for example, right? So in that case, it has a link, because the target or the end game is to secure the power and to rule according to these beliefs and scripture. Yeah. And also, it also has another link in terms of ideology, but maybe time wouldn't allow us to go there. But I think the first one answers your question. I think it's important to note that Christianity is one of the, or if I should put it this way, Africa is one of the continents that's received Christianity at a very early stage, right? You can talk about the Nubian kingdom. I don't know if you're aware of the kingdoms in Africa, because all of them have vanished. It's like Africa has never had any kingdom anyway. So maybe you may want to look into the kingdoms that ever existed in Africa. So the Nubian kingdom actually is very Christian in nature, right? That is before, colonialism. But colonization also bring another form of Christianity, which is evangelical in nature, together with the system of governance. So in terms of religious conflicts, having, relationship with the movement of a group of people from one place to the other, I think that there is the risk of conflict in there, because, for example, we know in the context of Nigeria, and of course, true, even though it's a novel, but it's also a true story. Those of you who have read Chinua Achebe, for example, Things Fall Apart, it sets a very interesting scenario with respect to how traditional religion or the Igbos actually resisted the influence of, Christianity in a way. Now, definitely, if there is a new element coming into a very conservative society in terms of religion, there will be a conflict, definitely. So what the thing I would like to say is that there is still there is conflict, and this conflict actually there's a link with conflict, and this conflict continues till day in case of the by the way, in terms of cultural anthropology of the Kunsan, I'm not having a very detailed information about them, but also I'm just drawing on some of the aspects of the encounters of indigenous societies with foreign elements in terms of Christianity, and how the conflicts with them has continued to influence religious conflicts in the continent till date. Yes. Religion actually is sometimes, as Scott Appleby will put it, the ambivalence of the sacred, right? So it leads to escalation and de-escalation of conflict. So in the extreme situation, as you mentioned, in terms of the triggers, yes, we do have individuals or religious leaders or clerics that through their actions and pronouncements actually serve as a trigger to conflicts, religious conflicts. And but I decided to focus on de-escalation because I thought that those were very commonplace. We see them in the news and all that. So I focused more on the issue of de-escalation and give some examples with respect to religious leadership. But yes, you are right. Unfortunately, that is how religion is. It's kind of ambivalent in terms of being a source of escalation at the same time as also a source of de-escalation. So in this case, religion becomes a source of trigger for various reasons, maybe misinterpretations of the text or understanding of some sayings of religious figures. In the case of Islam, for example, how do you define a blasphemous statement against the prophet? I think is something that is contested, for example. But yet, unfortunately, people are being killed for whatsoever reason in terms of the definition of, blasphemy, for instance. So yes, you are right. There are so many things we could discuss in terms of the other extreme of religion as a trigger of conflicts for various reasons, or people using it to engage or to extend or to add more fuel to the fire in terms of what is already existing between two communities, yes, or two faiths. Yeah.